Today's lecture is going to be about how we need to look at the questions of the dehumanization of Ukrainians in the Russian media, in Russian state official discourse, in the Russian school system, which is a precursor to the war crimes and the genocidal policies of the Russian military and security forces in Ukraine after 2022. In every case where there's been genocide, whether it's the Holodomor, the mass man-made famine in Ukraine in 1933, or the Holocaust against Jews in World War II, whenever there's been that kind of genocide, there's always been a precursor of dehumanization, a way to make those human beings into lesser beings who can be very easily killed, tortured, murdered, whatever, raped. And this is always the sort of the decade or so before the actual genocide takes place. It kind of softens up the implementers of the genocide to look upon the people they are committing crimes against to not be really human beings. And in this case, what we're looking at in the Russian case is this kind of dehumanizing discourse against Ukrainians and against the Ukrainian state already having taken place nearly 2 decades from the mid-2000s prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If we go on to slide 3, where we look at this, we're going back to the same question we've looked at before, which is that Putin in particular, but not only him, because he sets the agenda in Russia, of course, has had a long-term obsession with Ukraine. This is very much related to his anger and obsession with how he believes, and his former KGB allies who are running and ruling Russia with him, believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of Western conspiracies. They don't want to accept that the USSR disintegrated because of economic problems and problems of non-Russian nationalism, say in Ukraine, Georgia, Estonia, elsewhere. They want to believe this was a product of Western conspiracies, and therefore they need to deal with this and maybe overcome this. And the way they overcome this is by bringing, in particular, the Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians back together again in some kind of Russian union. And the key country here is, of course, Ukraine, because Belarus is long controlled by Russia under Alexander Lukashenko, but Ukraine keeps remaining outside the Russian orbit. Under every Ukrainian president, the one exception being, of course, Viktor Yanukovych, where Russia believed finally it had found its Alexander Lukashenko in Ukraine. That obsession is a driving obsession for Putin, certainly a factor in his decision to launch a full-scale invasion in 2022, and must very much lie behind the fact that Putin cannot let go of Ukraine. If he fails in Ukraine in whatever way, either with a military defeat or a Trump peace plan, that will be the end of Putin. Putin wants to go into history, into Russian history, as the Russian leader who was instrumental in bringing back Ukraine into the Ruski Mir, into the Russian world. He would be then seen as, again, like Joseph Stalin, like Peter the Great, as a gatherer, a uniter of so-called Russian lands. Linked to this is a inheritance, partly from the Soviet Union, but more from pre-Soviet era, that Ukrainians simply don't exist. There's some kind of, exotic cultural group. They speak a funny kind of Russian dialect. They like to dance songs, sing. But in effect, they are just a branch of the Russian people. This term is Общерусский народ, a pan-Russian nation. I think very few people have done this, but I mean, you could compare this to the Nazis' preoccupation with a pan-Germanism. Here we have a pan-Russianism, which goes back to the late 19th century and which has been revived in Putin's Russia with the republication and rehabilitation of writings by these Russian anti-Bolshevik white emigres who fled to Europe and lived there in the 20s, 30s and 40s. These white Russians began to return to Russia. Their bodies were exhumed from Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and their remains were brought to Russia from the mid-2000s. Their books were republished in massive circulations. These were spread around the Russian military, around the school classrooms, state officials. And this expanded the notion amongst the population at large that Ukraine is not a real country and Ukrainians are just a branch of the Russian people. This did draw on some Soviet legacy, not completely. The Soviet Union had a peculiar approach to this. Unlike the pre-Soviet period where Ukrainians were just simply denied that they existed, in the Soviet period, the Soviet authorities did not deny Ukrainians. Ukrainians existed. They had their own separate republic. They had a seat at the United Nations together with Belarus and the Soviet Union. And so there was some kind of recognition of Ukraine as a so-called sovereign Soviet Ukrainian republic. At the same time, the Soviet Union promoted a propaganda campaign ideologically by the Communist Party in schools, by the KGB, that Ukrainians and Russians were born together 1,000 years ago in Kyivan Rus. They always wanted to be together despite kind of Western conspiracies and machinations, and they always will be together. So yes, they were separate, Russians and Ukrainians, but they were all also always united. And that kind of propaganda that Ukrainians and Russians are kind of inseparable has remained very much deep in the Russian psyche. And this is not just Putin. Putin was preceded by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian dissident nationalist writer, who already a year before the USSR disintegrated wrote a pamphlet called where he called for Russians to support the USSR disintegrating, but for a Russian Union to replace that. By Russian Union, he meant this union of three Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And that concept of a Solzhenitsyn Russian Union from 1990 is something that Putin picked up on and he supported, and Solzhenitsyn and Putin became close friends towards the end of Solzhenitsyn's life. The Russian world, which was created as a foundation in 2007, was pretty much the Alexander Solzhenitsyn model of a Russian Union. So yes, Estonians can go their own way, maybe Tajiks can go their own way, even Armenians, but Ukrainians, Belarusians have to be always united and together with Russians. So that deepened that kind of obsession about Ukrainians. And this has a long pedigree, as I say, going back to the mid-2000s. You see this in Vladimir Zhirinovsky's comments, and in comments in general in the Russian media, going back a long time before the full-scale invasion.
Взяли ребенка 3 лет, мальчика маленького, в трусиках, футболке, как Иисуса, на доску объявления прибыли.
Украину отремонтировать невозможно. Вот эта конструкция, которая не поддается уже ремонту. Ее необходимо просто разрушить. Разрушить как Россию, как субъектность, которая угрожает России.
Сука, этой страны не должно быть. И мы сделаем все, чтобы ее не было. И я вам, блядь, говорил, мы сожжем вашу конституцию, блядь.
This just gives you a kind of a flavor of this Russian discourse, rhetoric, propaganda, disinformation about Ukrainians, which has been pumped into the heads of the Russian people for a long period of time prior to even 2014, the first Russian invasion, never mind the full-scale invasion in 2022. It already had some, as it were, germination there anyway from the Soviet period, but this intensified this. Ukrainians were not just pawns of the West, they were traitors. They had betrayed this concept of a Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood, so-called, this Russian-Ukrainian unity, which was God-given, which was there from day one in Kyivan Rus 1,000 years ago, and which cannot ever be, as it were, undermined. So it's worse than a kind of a regular war. This is in the eyes of these Russian nationalists, this is a civil war between different branches of one Russian people, one Russian nation. If we go on to now slide 7, we can look at how this long gestation of anti-Ukrainian discourse, rhetoric, prepared the ground for the war crimes and the genocide which has taken place in Ukraine since 2022. This is also, of course, a product of, besides the dehumanization of Ukrainians, also a product of Russia never dealing with, and its past never expunging and coming to terms with the crimes it as a country had committed in the past. One of the most important aspects of post-communism, as it were, is dealing with the past, removing that legacy and critically appraising the past, particularly the crimes committed by the communist regimes, in whether it's in the Soviet Union or in Central Eastern Europe. Ukraine has done that. Ukraine has been doing this non-stop really since the late 1980s. It kind of had a few problems. It went astray a little bit under Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president from 2010, 2013, 2014. But academics continued their work. Think tanks continued their work. I mean, Yanukovych's presidency wasn't yet, it would have been if he'd have continued in power, but at that stage it wasn't yet a dictatorship, so there was still avenues to do alternative academic research. And so Ukrainians have been at this, dealing with the past, expunging the past, critically evaluating the Tsarist and Soviet regimes for over 3 decades, nearly 4 decades, if we go back to the mid-1980s. The Russians have never done this. The Russians believe they're innocent of any crimes. They've never even ever looked at Soviet crimes. In fact, the opposite. Stalin is a hero. Stalin's crimes against everybody, including against the Russian people, have been ignored, downplayed, kind of denied. And so this inevitably feeds into a lack of kind of respect for human rights and not seeing as a problem torture, extrajudicial killings of civilians, raping, and just generally crimes. And of course, one of the most egregious crimes is the deportation of Ukrainian children and their denationalization and Russification. This is a genocidal policy of trying to destroy Ukraine's future by Russifying and denationalizing its children. That is coupled with a mocking, the laughing about Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. Ukrainians are incapable of running their own country. They're just peasant bumpkins. They can only run an artificial country with the help of the CIA or European Union or the United States. They would never be able to do it themselves. These revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan Revolution, they could never have done this on their own. This had to be a CIA operation directed against Russia. Ukrainian language is a joke, it's just a dialect. And culture, give me a break. Ukraine has no culture. And more importantly, from the viewpoint of what we're discussing, for Russian leaders, Ukraine has no history. What history are we talking about? Because Russia is trying to steal Ukrainian history. Russian nationalists and Putin talk always about 1,000 years of Russian statehood. What 1,000 years are we talking about? When Kyivan Rus existed, Moscow was a village which only came into existence in 1147, just on the eve of the Mongol invasion. Kiev is, the Soviet regime even celebrated 1,500 years of the city of Kiev in 1982. So Kiev itself is 600 years older than Moscow. So the idea that somehow Russia is the inheritor of this Kyivan Rus is simply wrong. But this is a way of claiming that Ukraine has no separate history and no history of its own statehood. Ukrainian historians, of course, disagree with this. Going back over 100 years with Mykhailo Hrushevsky, they say alternatively that actually Kyivan Rus was the first Ukrainian state because most of it was within the boundaries of the Ukrainian state of today. And after the Mongol invasion in 1240, that inheritance of Kyivan Rus transferred over to the Galician-Volhynian kingdom, where it remained until the 14th century when that became part of Lithuania-Polish Commonwealth. So the idea that sort of, the Russian nationalist interpretation is that it was Kiev, Russia, of course, not Kyivan Rus, Kiev, Russia, then Vladimir Suzdal, then Muscovy, then the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and then the Russian Federation. This translatio of the Russian state. This has nothing to do with historical reality, but this is what is promoted by the Russian state under Putin. And you can see this with the installing of a huge monument to Grand Prince Volodymyr in 2016 next to the Kremlin. Of course, again, the irony is that when he ruled Kyivan Rus in the late 10th, early 11th century, there was no Moscow. Moscow didn't exist. So again, this is a claim to something that Russia has no right to claim to, but it's a way of denying that to Ukraine as well at the same time. So Ukraine doesn't exist. Ukrainians don't exist. They have no right to decide their own future. Whether they like it or not, they have to be part of Russia, and Ukrainians have to understand that they are little Russians. They're not Ukrainians. They have been hoodwinked by the West into believing they're Ukrainians. This goes back again to the late 19th century. It was the Austrians, then it was the Poles, then now it's, Lenin was wrong to give the Ukrainians a separate republic, and now it's the CIA and European Union. if you think about this, this is an incredibly bizarre cabal of people. Austrians, Poles, Lenin, CIA, and European Union were all conspirators against poor Mother Russia. But the way then this becomes a kind of a threat to Russia is that Ukraine is a supposed springboard for a potential attack against Russia. Because Ukraine wants to join NATO, European Union, and NATO wants to come in, create military bases, install missiles, etc., which will then be used to attack Russia. And all of this conjures up a kind of a threat scenario, which of course had nothing to do with reality. Ukraine, in fact, has never been offered NATO membership. So for extreme left-wing journalists or academics who keep going on about NATO enlargement was the reason why there's been military aggression against Ukraine by Russia, they're talking out of their backsides completely. Ukraine has never received an offer for NATO membership, and in fact, the United States and Germany have been staunch opponents of that. The last US president to support Ukraine's membership of NATO was George Bush back in 2008, so a long time ago. The European Union only offered Ukraine candidate status as a potential future member in 2023. So when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, there was no offer of NATO membership, no offer of EU membership, and NATO and the US have never ever contemplated putting military bases into Ukraine. So this is all mythical, made up, fake news by the Kremlin. On the final note here, we have the sad situation where the Kremlin and Russian nationalists like Putin have returned to pre-Gorbachev discourse surrounding the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, the Ukrainian artificial famine of 1933. So now it's denied. This famine was something that affected everybody, and those who were in the 1980s writing about the famine, like Robert Conquest, were in fact British spies, and you can't trust them. These views of Ukraine and Ukrainians are not restricted to a small group of people. They're not just restricted to those who support Putin or Russian nationalists. They have far wider support within the Russian population. And the very old Ukrainian saying that Russian liberalism ends on the Ukrainian border is very true here. Alexei Navalny, the tragic former leader of the opposition who was murdered in prison by Putin earlier this year, is an example of this. He supported the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia. He supported the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. He condemned and criticized Ukraine's drive to receive independence, autocephaly, for its Orthodox Church from Russia. And he did actually say Ukrainians and Russians are one people, so repeating the Kremlin or Putin's propaganda about this. And the Navalny's, including his now widowed spouse, have never really condemned the Russian full-scale war and genocidal war against Ukraine, and they've been very timid on this. And she has actually at times questioned why the West should be giving military support to Ukraine. So we should try to understand that this is a more wider problem for the Russian population than simply just people who are pro-Putin.
сторонникам, которые удивлены, я хочу сказать вещь, что удивляться не нужно. Я 4-й год подряд хожу на русский марш.
Им стоит бояться! Им стоит бояться! Да!
Кавказ соси! Кавказ соси!
Кавказ! Аллах, пидорас!
As we can see, Navalny began his political career in the 2000s as part of this Russian Nazi nationalist groupings, and he attended these annual marches with these Russian Nazis and nationalists. He was actually very racist in far more of a way than even Donald Trump is towards minorities, towards people from the Caucasus and people from Central Asia who were working in Russian cities. So he then kind of mellowed out later on after say 2012, but he was always in many ways as much of a nationalist as he was a so-called liberal Democrat. And this problem of Russians coming to accept that Ukrainians are separate to them, Ukraine has a right to decide its own destiny, its own future, and that Crimea is internationally and legally part of Ukraine, is something that I think still many Russians find difficult to accept. One way to look at how this has developed in Russia is to show how so different it is from Ukraine, is that you've had this you could call it red, brown, white alliance, which has been evolving in various ways since at least the late 1980s. What do we mean by this? Well, the reds are obvious. These are the pro-Soviet communists, or at least those who are nostalgic for the Soviet Union. Brown is usually the color associated with fascist movements. Whites, these are what I've already been talking about, the anti-Bolshevik forces who were called the Whites, who were defeated and then they fled to Europe, where they were very active in the 20s, 30s and 40s. This kind of very disparate and group of people from the extreme right to the extreme left could never work together in Ukraine. Forget it. The Ukrainian patriotic and nationalist parties hate pro-Russian forces and they hate the Communist Party of Ukraine. So the idea that that could happen in Ukraine is simply impossible. In Russia, that's possible because the idea of Russia as a great power, the idea of Russia being bigger than the Russian Republic, is something that unites these different groups and brings them together. And these groups, reds, browns and whites, were behind the two hardline coups in August 91 and autumn 93, and these are mainstream now inside Russia. They are the groupings backing Vladimir Putin and backing the war against Ukraine. And that, I think, is something we should take into account. One of the leading members of this kind of very broad-based group of people is a fascist, Eurasianist, anti-Semite, Aleksandr Dugin. He's, I think many Russianists in the West were wrong to claim, oh, he's not very influential, it's not true. Well, he's now heading an academic institution in Moscow. He is influential. He's so influential that the Ukrainian secret services tried to assassinate him back in 2022 by some strange fate. It was his daughter that was killed, not him, because they switched cars after a rally. But it shows you to what extent, at least the Ukrainian leaders, believe that Dugin is a genocidal promoter of genocidal rhetoric and discourse against Ukrainians. And you can see this in this comment he made back in 2014, which maybe then seemed a bit radical for Russians, but today these kinds of comments are mainstream in the Russian media. Ukrainians who don't accept that they are little Russians are people who need to be exterminated. They need to be dealt with. The only good Ukrainians are those who accept that they are little Russians. So they divide Ukrainians into Ukrainians who think they are a distinct people to Russians who need to be dealt with in a violent way, and little Russians who do accept they're part of this Russian or pan-Russian nation, who are okay, they're fine. And this kind of comment maybe was seen as a bit too way out there, but today it's no longer the case. Coupled with this, and we're back now, we've moved on now to slide 13, coupled with this is this very deep culture of lying in the Soviet and the former Soviet, now Russian leadership. The biggest lie that Russia's promoting all the time is that it's not really invading Ukraine. It was forced to act because Ukraine was becoming a threat to Russia. NATO was about to invite Ukraine in, and NATO was about to install missiles and military bases in Ukraine. And so this was a preemptive attack to prevent all of this. All of this is complete lies. But this is the mythology that the so-called special military operation isn't in fact a war against Ukraine. It's a kind of a preemptive incursion, as it were, which of course has nothing to do with reality.
Главная проблема России – это чтобы рядом с нами не было нацистского враждебного государства, которое в любой момент... Конечно, нацистское. А какое вы еще? Вы нацисты. И вы не должны это понять. Вы принимаете нацистские законы. И вот это прикрытие из премьера еврея и президента еврея ни в коей мере вам не помогут. Ваша идеология нацистская, ваши праздники нацистские.
Сорос не выражает интересы демократов, он не выражает интересы Америки, он выражает интерес того самого глобального правительства, той самой группы денежных мешков, которые хотят построить вот этот вот горизонтальный мир.
Это характерная современная карикатура. Ротшильды подпитывают и ЦРУ, и английскую разведку Ми-6, и запрещенную в большинстве стран мира террористическую группировку ИГИЛ.
The many components of Russia's propaganda disinformation campaign against Ukraine, the biggest one is, of course, the claim that Ukraine's run by fascists and Nazis. This has zero to do with Western political science understandings of those terms, absolutely nothing to do with that. Ukraine's elections show that far-right forces have no popularity in Ukraine. In fact, only on one election in 2012 did a nationalist party ever enter the Ukrainian parliament. So compared to most European countries, Ukraine has the lowest support, electoral support for far-right parties, far less than, say, in Central Eastern Europe, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and certainly far less than in Germany, France, and elsewhere. So this is a Soviet use of, it's going back to the Soviet use of this terminology, Nazi fascist, which is applicable to anybody who disagrees with Russia. If you are a socialist, anarchist, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter what, and you still believe that Ukrainians are a distinct people to Russians, if you do not believe Ukrainians are little Russians, if you believe that Ukraine has a right to be part of Europe and not doesn't have to be part of the Russian world and Eurasia. If you believe all of those things and you think that the Euromaidan revolution was great, then you are a Nazi. You are a fascist. It's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter that Ukraine's run by a Jewish Ukrainian president whose family suffered in the Holocaust. As we just saw, that's just a camouflage because you know, these kinds of things happened in elsewhere, and Russian propaganda even claims that, well, you know, Zionists were always in bed with Nazis anyway. And this is one of the claims made against Zelensky. This again goes back to the Soviet Union because Soviet propaganda always in the 70s, particularly in the late 60s, 1970s, and for much of the 1980s, claimed that Zionists and Ukrainian nationalists collaborated together against the Soviet Union. So this again has roots back in the Soviet system. Let's now look at some examples of how Russian TV promotes this genocidal discourse against Ukraine and Ukrainians.
Украинское государство, по сути дела, должно быть ликвидировано полностью, да? Путем раздела, путем полного присоединения к России, но полностью. Сейчас у нас уже другого выхода, с моей точки зрения, не осталось.
Вот, да, я пытался сравнить, ну, для себя, что если, допустим, отрезать и забыть какую-то часть, да, вот тут как раз про которую вы сейчас говорите, это будет куда хуже даже Прибалтики, которая сейчас всячески пытается вставить палки в колеса. Совершенно... Это будет очень агрессивная Прибалтика.
Совершенно правильно. Значит, причем не важно, именно 3 области или 10 областей, даже не важно, какие области. Если оставить не Галицию, оставить Одесскую и Николаевскую область, будет ровно там то же самое. Это особенность человеческого мышления. Если мы остались независимыми, да, значит, мы выиграли свою независимость, мы отвоевали ее. Значит, и поэтому будем отвоевывать дальше. Вот. Значит, повторяю, значит, поэтому у нас не остается другого выхода, как ликвидация Украины. И даже если сейчас в Кремле рассматривают какие-то другие моменты, все равно эмпирическим путем они придут к тому, что Украину необходимо ликвидировать. Ну, договариваться, во-первых, не будем, потому что необходимо создавать или так осваивать территории, когда просто выгодно России. То есть необходимо осваивать территорию, необходимо местное население, из местного населения формировать нормальный, обычный русский народ. Это тем проще, что говорят они не по-английски, не по-французски, не по-немецки. Говорят они все по-русски. Значит, соответственно, объяснить новым поколениям, да, что на самом деле они русские, не думаю, что это будет представлять какую-то там сверхсложную задачу. Просто надо не спеша, упорно и последовательно работать над этим. Это даже не потому, что, ну, как там, кому-то это хочется. С тех пор, как начались боевые действия в феврале.
This is probably enough to understand the degree to which this kind of genocidal rhetoric is taking place on Russian TV, radio, in Russian print media. I think many people in the West find it difficult to get their heads around that in 21st century Europe, a war is taking place where one side, Russia, wants to actually destroy a state, Ukraine, and wants to destroy Ukrainian identity. This is simply, I think, very mind-boggling for us to accept this is taking place, because we assumed that this was something that only happened in the past. You know, it was something to do with Stalin era and the Hitler Nazi era. But this is the goal this was the invasion goal of 2022. And if it had gone to plan as Russia intended, this so-called special military operation was supposed to take a couple of weeks at the maximum, and Ukraine would be defeated, a puppet regime would be installed, there would be massive genocide. The Russian army and Russian security services came with kill lists of teachers, civil society activists, journalists, politicians, religious leaders who were to be either deported, executed, or imprisoned. That was the goal. It didn't work out as Russia intended, Ukrainians fought back, and in 2022 had many military successes in Kharkiv, Kherson, and of course, importantly, the Kyiv region. But this was the goal, and this goal has not changed. It's called denazification, demilitarization, but it's de facto genocide. And this is why the idea that somehow Putin will negotiate a peace deal where the war would be frozen on the current contact lines is simply just romantic. It's not going to happen because it will not fulfill the Russian nationalist Kremlin original invasion goal, which is destroy Ukraine and destroy Ukrainian identity. That won't take place. So I'm not confident that Russia will accept any peace plan promoted by Donald Trump, because that freezing of the current conflict will simply not give the Kremlin what it wants from this war. There are other examples of this kind of genocidal rhetoric. It literally is available every day on Russian TV and radio. This is nothing just peculiar to certain, shall we say, presenters. It happens literally every day. There are now books being published which analyze this expanded genocidal discourse and rhetoric. I think the viewpoint which was probably in a minority from people like me back in 2022, that Russia's goal was genocidal, has now spread and become more, I would say, dominant amongst Western policymakers and analysts. But certainly something that many of us found very difficult to accept. This particular one that I'm going to show you now is something that stunned many people because it referred to Ukrainian children.
Я в 80-м году первый раз оказался на Украине ребенком еще, и мне просто украинские западная Украина.
I'll give you the background. One of the journalists is talking about him visiting West Ukraine, where he didn't have a great experience because he was from Russia, and it kind of affected him negatively. And then the journalist who's actually interviewing him says, well, the way we have to deal with this in the future is by literally killing these Ukrainian children, burning them, drowning them, and such like. There is no English subtitles here, so there's no probably, you can watch this yourselves, but this became an international scandal. And the Russian TV channel RT, used to be called Russia Today, removed this journalist for a short period of time, but of course he's now back on the channel. But it goes to show you the extent of this. We shouldn't be surprised. Yale University, just in December 2024, published a long report about the deportation, denationalization, and Russification of Ukrainian children. So this idea that Russia needs to deal with the problem of destroying Ukrainian identity by focusing on the children, either murdering them or denationalizing and Russifying them, is already being talked about by Russian journalists. If we have this as the background, it's not surprising, therefore, that the Russian army is committing the extent of the war crimes it's committing in Ukraine. And just to give you that as an example, the Ukrainian prosecutor's office has collected a mind-boggling number of 130,000 war crimes committed by Russia since 24th of February 2022. So in less than 3 years, we have over 100,000 cases. Just in the last year, something like over 100 Ukrainian prisoners of war were executed. I mean, this is a war crime. They were executed by Russian soldiers just in the last year itself. This kind of atmosphere, we should understand, is linked as well to domestic environment inside Russia and external environment inside Ukraine. The two are closely interconnected, which is why my colleague Ian Garner and myself are now editing a book about how Russia is a fascist state. We believe Russia became a fascist state after the constitution was changed in 2020, which moved Russia from an authoritarian to a dictatorship, and Russia as a fascist state from at least 2022. What Russia has done and what Putin's regime has done is an attempt to, as it were, cleanse inside Russia, to get rid of troublemakers inside Russia, to put troublemakers in jail or force them to flee abroad, to cleanse, as he calls it, the environment inside Russia, to mobilize those who are remaining in Russia on a pro-war, anti-Ukrainian platform. This is very much, in political science, the difference between a dictatorship and a fascist dictatorship and an authoritarian regime, is that an authoritarian regime, for example, a military junta, does not require the population to be active. The population can be left to be passive. In a dictatorship, in a fascist dictatorship, the regime wants the population to be mobilized in support of its goals. And this is one way you can differentiate the Putin's Russia after 2020 to that prior to that. Now you have this mobilization of Russians in support of genocide.
Во многих западных странах людей только за то, что они родом из России, подвергают настоящей травле сегодня. Отказывают в медицинской помощи, изгоняют детей из школ, лишают работы их родителей. Запрещают русскую музыку, культуру, литературу, пытаясь отменить Россию. Но любой народ, а тем более российский народ, всегда сможет отличить истинных патриотов от подонков и предателей и просто выплюнет их, как случайно залетевшую в рот мушку, выплюнет на панель. Убежден, такое естественное и необходимое самоочищение общества только укрепит нашу страну.
The traitors who have to be spat out, who have to be cleansed, are inside Russia and outside Russia in Ukraine. These are all traitors, and they have to be dealt with inside Russia by the Russian regime and outside Russia by the Russian army and security forces. So the kinds of genocide, subtle acts we've seen taking place in Ukraine by the Russian army and security services have been mass killings on a scale nobody's seen this since the last time was probably the Yugoslav civil war with the massacre of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica. Deliberate attacks on Ukraine civilians, evacuation routes, and hospitals, schools, and such like. Indiscriminate bombardment of residential areas. None of these are military targets in any way. And one of the reasons why 2 senior Russian generals have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. The destruction of vital infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, is again a war crime, but undertaken by Russia. Attacks on this horrific attack on the children's hospital was done this year by Russia in Kiev. We have rape and sexual violence, something we know the Soviet army committed a lot in Eastern Europe and in Germany in World War II, is now being committed by the Russian army as well. By the way, both against women and against men who were in captivity as prisoners of war. And the forcible deportation of Ukrainians inside Russia, both children and adults, especially from places in East Ukraine like Mariupol, which have been destroyed by Russia. Let's look now at some of these examples of war crimes.
Real life has no filters. Inconvenient truth can't be just blurred out. Real war is happening right now in Ukraine. The label's sensitive content can't erase the blood of Ukrainians who are suffering from Russian aggression daily. Russia is a terrorist state. The world has to see it with no filters to see the truth.
Russia is a terrorist state, and it's a condemnation of the Biden administration, which refused to add Russia to its list of states which promote terrorism. That list includes countries like Iran, Syria under the former regime of Assad, North Korea, but Russia is the key and the biggest terrorist state of them all. These war crimes are on a scale that, as I say, we saw them to some degree in the Yugoslav civil war committed by primarily Serbs against Muslims and Croats, but this is on a scale that Europe hasn't seen for a long time. Mariupol is an interesting case. This was a city of nearly 500,000 people. It was practically all destroyed, all flattened by the Russian army in the spring of 2022. There are many close analogies to how Russia helped the Syrians destroy the city of Aleppo back after 2015, which is quite ironic now with the overthrow of the Assad regime, Assad pro-Russian regime. But even prior to that, Putin came to power in 2000 for the first time in 2000, and then there was an ongoing war in Chechnya, and Putin ordered the destruction of the city of Grozny then, and the killing of about 100,000 Chechens during that war. Mariupol still has not recovered from that. Many of the Ukrainians have either been killed or deported or have fled. And any new buildings which are going up in Mariupol are given to Russian new settlers. This shows you the destruction of Mariupol. This is deliberate genocidal destruction by Russia, both in Aleppo, previously in Syria, and in Mariupol in Ukraine. And this is in a city which was a Russian-speaking city. It was a city that voted for pro-Russian parties. So the myth that Russia was launching a special military operation to protect Russian speakers was completely bogus and a lie, as we can see from this Mariupol. One of the most, as I've already mentioned, one of the most egregious aspects of these war crimes is the treatment of children. Already this so-called Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights was indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war crime, a perpetrator of war crimes. But Russia has never really denied that it's taken these children. Of course, it's lied as to the reasons why it's taken them. Their parents are killed, or they want to give them a better life. Of course, these are all lies. And nobody knows a true figure. The minimum number is at least 20,000.
My name is Vladislav Boryak.
This is a testimony of some of those children.
At the age of 16, and was in captivity for precisely 90 days.
My name is Vitaly. I am 14 years old.
My name is Sasha. I am 12 years old. And I have been looking for my mother since last March.
My uncle and I went for a walk at lunch, and the occupiers passed by. They stopped and checked our phones. The occupiers saw that we were corresponding with the Ukrainian military, took us to a gas station, and beat us on the kidneys and face. Then we were thrown into a pit where there were intestines of pigs or other creatures. We sat there for 2 hours. They threatened to throw a grenade into a pit, bury us, shoot us. Then they put a bag on our heads, tied our hands with ropes.
He took me out of the car, pointed a machine gun at me, and asked me, "Should I shoot you right now or smash your phone?" I was terrified. These were emotions that are difficult to describe because you understand that right now you can be shot literally for nothing.
We stood by the barbecue, cooking because it was impossible to cook at home. But then the shelling began. I heard an explosion. I was contused. I felt a hot splinter. I shouted to my mother that my eye hurt, that my eye was burning. Then my mother and I looked for medical help to cure my eye. We went to the Illich plant. There were military medics there.
For the first time in the history of mankind, the leader of a state with nuclear weapons was criminally charged by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. I think this is insufficient. There should be far more higher level crimes instituted against Putin, including the crime of genocide. It is surprising that the International Criminal Court just recently, in late 2024, indicted the leader of Hamas, the terrorist group, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, yet it did not indict the bloodthirsty dictator of Syria, Assad, and Putin, who after 2015 committed massive war crimes in Syria and then went on to, of course, commit them in Ukraine. 600,000 Syrians were killed by the Russians and Syrian regime, and millions were forced to flee the country. So why did the International Criminal Court not indict Assad and Putin then? Why did it have to wait in the case of Putin until 2023 because of the invasion of Ukraine? That is something that inevitably leads to many people thinking it's biased, for example, implementing criminal charges against the Israeli Prime Minister. But nevertheless, this issue of war crimes will not go away. And the number of people we're talking about is far greater than simply Putin. It's not only that the entire practical journalistic class in Russia is guilty of these crimes, as we've already seen. They are promoting genocidal and hate language against Ukrainians for nearly 20 years in the Russian media, TV, radio, print media, but also education system, military leaders, and of course different political forces. So this is a far bigger group of people. The entire regime is guilty of this. It's not just a few people. I mean, we are talking about huge numbers of people. And I think one of the mistakes that you get amongst Western Russianists is that they can't accept the fact that this is a war supported by most people inside Russia. And therefore they argue, no, this is just a war conducted by Putin. That cannot be true, but just because of the huge numbers of people involved. Both, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church is involved in its own way and supports this genocidal war. Teachers which are sent from Russia to the occupied territories of Ukraine, state officials, huge numbers in the Russian army, security services, journalists, and of course other ancillary actors, whether they're working in the in industry producing weapons for the Russian military. 750,000 Russians are casualties in this war. So practically all of them have died, because most Russian wounded tend to die on the battlefield. They're not collected by their colleagues. That already means millions of people, because each one of those Russians belongs to a family of people with 2, 3, 4 other people. That already we're talking about millions just there. And then we're talking about all of the supporters and other people who are very active in Russian social media and other areas of Russia supporting the war. And I think one of the things we have to ask as well is, why is this huge Russian diaspora, which now exists in the West, in particular in Europe, why is it so passive? Why is it so quiet? In the Cold War, the biggest Ukrainian diaspora in Western Europe was in Britain, where I grew up. It was 30,000 strong. Today in England, there are about 130 to 150,000 Russians. So far, far more than there were Ukrainians in the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had demonstrations practically every week outside the Soviet embassy. Either just Ukrainians or Ukrainians with Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, and others. But certainly there was something always happening outside the Soviet embassy to condemn Soviet regime for its repression of Ukrainians and other peoples. Why is there never a single protest and demonstration by the Russian diaspora outside the Russian embassy? Never a single one. The Syrians are protesting in London, Ukrainians, but no Russians are protesting, or at least wanted only a handful, shall we say. So one has to ask, are they not against this war which is taking place? Why are they acting like ostriches and putting their heads in the sand, wanting it to go away and trying to claim it's nothing to do with them? It's got everything to do with them. This war is taking place on behalf of the Russian state. You are Russian, therefore you have to take a stance, either support or oppose. You can't stand in the middle. You can't sit on the fence. So it's about time Russians began to say if they really are against the war. There are, of course, a very good group of, not very many, Russians who have opposed the war. Garry Kasparov, the former chess master, and 1 or 2 others who are living in Kiev and who are supporting these Russian volunteer battalions fighting on the side of Ukraine. But these tend to be a minority. Alexei Navalny's widow in the West has been actually very poor in her media interviews about the war, and has questioned various aspects of Western policy, such as supporting Ukraine militarily. So that needs to be changed. The final thing I'd like to end on is how Ukraine has achieved, and this I think is very much to the credit of President Volodymyr Zelensky, achieved a huge amount of support in the West, not only from politicians, but also from journalists, from volunteer groups. I mean, I traveled to Ukraine with British volunteers. These are all people with no Ukrainian background who want to help Ukraine, and also with musicians and people working in the cultural field. And here I think I would like to end on a very good note with a great song by Imagine Dragons, dealing with a young Ukrainian boy from eastern Ukraine who they have tried to help because of what he's had to suffer during this war.
Supposed to be exactly what they want her to be. So pretty in pink, necklace and ring. heard, just be seen. That's not who I am. She said, I can feel too much, and I wish it go away, 'cause it's crushing me. It's crushing me. Don't you know that you don't ever say the scarlet ain't your next pretty red eyes are all dead. They ever said you're stuck in your head. The silence is deafening, and their heart is bleeding out. They don't care, no, they never cared at all. They never cared at all. That's not who I am. She said I could feel too much, and I wish it go away, 'cause it's crushing me. It's crushing me. It's crushing me. It's crushing me. She just wants to be free. Take it or leave it. Eyes like the sunrise, colorful rainbow. She said I could feel too much, and I wish it go away, 'cause they're crushing me. They're crushing me. They're crushing me. I can feel them crushing me. I can feel them crushing me. Crush down on me. Crush down on me.
Let's try and just quickly, to conclude this discussion about the dehumanization of Ukrainians, look at what I would call the 10 most important myths in Russia's propaganda disinformation campaigns against Ukraine. And this is just briefly, with no videos. The first one is, again, I've kind of talked about it, the idea that Ukraine is some kind of artificial entity. It doesn't really exist. It doesn't have any history of statehood. That it's a patchwork of territories. The south and east of Ukraine should be part of Russia. Russian leaders like Putin call southeast Ukraine historical Russian lands. Ukraine's far smaller. So this is a kind of one of the first aspects of this. Ukraine is an artificial conglomerate. I mean, you can easily answer this by looking at any European country and say, well, every European country is artificial. There's no such thing as a natural country. And every country has this patchwork. I mean, Russia has 24 autonomous republics, for Christ's sake. I mean, you know, should they be part of Russia? I mean, if we started applying what Russia says about Ukraine to Russia itself, Russia would have a problem. There are many territories in Russia that shouldn't belong to Russia. Karelia should be part of Finland. Kaliningrad should be part of Germany, and the Kuril lands should be part of Japan. Just to one thing. And what about Chechnya being independent? So, I mean, this is one of the areas that is one of the myths, shall we say. The second one, again, I've talked about the idea that Ukrainians don't exist. There's just one people, Russians and Ukrainians. This is a stagnation from the Soviet period where then at least there was Ukrainians and Russians are different, but they're very close. Now it's Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Ukrainians are not a separate people. So we're going back to the pre-Soviet Tsarist kind of era. The idea that Russian speakers in Ukraine are repressed. If that's the case, why are so many Russian speakers in Ukraine fighting for Ukraine in the Ukrainian armed forces? Why are some of the best trained, best experienced Ukrainian troops like in the Azov Regiment and the 3rd Assault Brigade in the Ukrainian army, who are primarily these Ukrainian patriots from eastern Ukraine. The original Azov battalion was formed by football fans and activists in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. All the opinion polls always have shown this is not how Ukrainians believe the situation in Ukraine to be. No Ukrainians have ever found that Russian speakers are repressed or the Russian language is repressed in Ukraine. This is something dreamt up in Moscow. It's not something that Ukrainians believe. There's not a single opinion poll which says that majority of Ukrainians believe that Russian speakers in Ukraine or the Russian language has been repressed. This is a myth. The idea that somehow Ukrainians divide into two cultures, that you have this kind of western central Ukraine and then you have this eastern and southern Ukraine, and Ukraine's this kind of artificial kind of union of these two different entities, one pro-Western, one pro-Russian. Again, that's not true. Each region of Ukraine is a mixture of different orientation. Just to give you an example of West Ukraine, Galicia, which has 3 regions and which many people in the Ukrainian diaspora are from, is actually very different to neighboring Transcarpathia, and it's in turn very different to the Volyn region and the Chernivtsi regions, which are primarily Orthodox in their religion. So even in West Ukraine you have varieties, and that's also true of Eastern Ukraine. In 2014, Dnipropetrovsk, now called Dnipro, was a center for the creation of volunteer battalions to fight against pro-Russian forces in next door Donetsk. So that's just next door. Kharkiv is very different to Donetsk. It's an intellectual city, many universities. Up until 2014, a lot of foreign students, a lot of, shall we say, research bureaus and this kind of research institutes. Very different to Donetsk, which is more kind of working class, coal mining and steel mills. Very different. So even within eastern and southern Ukraine, it's very different. Odessa, again, cosmopolitan, a port, a very open city, and again, very different to Donetsk. The idea that these two regions are kind of united and in one kind of identity and very opposed to each other is simply not true, especially after 2014 and 2022, when Ukrainian identities began to crystallize more, and when Eastern and Western Ukrainians came more integrated and more united together. It also, again, when we're looking at this in a broader context, it's simply mythical to believe that every country is somehow completely united. I mean, just look at the United States, where there was nearly there was an attempted coup attempt a few years ago in Washington, D.C. And just look at how people on the East Coast and West Coast look at people inside the United States. Look at how in Canada everybody hates Toronto, and look at in England how everybody hates London. So the idea that somehow Ukraine is unique with these regional divisions is simply untrue. It's typical for every country. Just look at how not only Canada and Britain, but look at France. I mean, the way Paris is looked upon. One of the mythologies promoted even by Western historians of Russia was that Crimea was always Russian. My colleague, Professor Robert Magocci, has written about this, that this is a complete lie, a complete mythology. The idea that Crimean history began in 1783 is simply wrong. Crimea had a history prior to that, and it was Crimean Tatar, part of the Ottoman Empire, kind of a loose autonomy within the Ottoman Empire, but it had far more time as a Crimean Tatar Khanate than it did as Russian. So again, this is wrong, but it's surprisingly common to find this in the West as well amongst these so-called objective academic historians. Crimea was recognized as part of Ukraine. It was illegally annexed by Russia, and it's internationally recognized as part of Ukrainian territory. And if we start going down that route of saying, well, Crimea has a right to self-determination, which is the argument made by the Russian state, then where do we stop? Why is it not then also the case that 24 autonomous republics inside Russia also have a right to independence? Why is it just Ukraine this applies to? Let's apply it to everywhere then, including inside Russia, not just Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine's war is a civil war is less promoted today. It's still promoted by some Russian nationalists as a kind of a civil war between different branches of different parts of this so-called pan-Russian people. But it was certainly promoted after 2014 by Western pro-Russian academics, as well as, of course, the Kremlin. This was never a civil war, but sadly, even now, only just a year or so ago, a new book published by Dominic Karel and his colleague, Professor Dresko, talks about this as a civil war. So even the chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa, surprisingly not condemned by the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress, by the way. Why are they so quiet about this disinformation being on their doorstep in Ottawa? This kind of mythology that this was a civil war is simply untrue. My academic colleague Sergei Kudelia and myself and others have pointed out this was never the case. Russia was involved in Ukraine throughout the Yanukovych presidency from 2010 onwards, sabotaging the Ukrainian security services and the Ukrainian army, and was on the ground in Ukraine from day one of the Euromaidan revolution, and was involved in transforming protesters in Donetsk into armed insurgents already in the spring of 2014. There's a great PBS documentary about Ukraine published in or released in May of 2014 called Battleground Ukraine, which is focused on Kharkiv in the spring of that year. And these pro-Russian thugs openly admit that they were trained and paid by Russian intelligence services. So I'm sorry, Dominic Karel, you are completely wrong about this question. And I again refer to why is the Canadian-Ukrainian community so quiet about this disinformation on its own doorstep. This idea that Ukraine's a fascist and Nazi state is something I've already discussed. I won't go into it too much. You're a Nazi and fascist if you are a Ukrainian who doesn't accept that they are Little Russian. Simple as that. It doesn't matter what your ethnic group is. You can be Jewish like President Zelensky, or you can be not Jewish, and you can be socialist or even a conservative. The idea that the Ukrainian famine of 1933 was not a genocide against Ukraine. This is now a view supported by the majority of Ukrainians. All opinion polls show 75–80% of Ukrainians support the idea that Stalin tried to commit genocide against the Ukrainian people. This is also recognized by many countries in the outside world, as well as Ukraine. It's something that is still kind of discussed and debated by Western academics. Some accept this, some don't. But it is connected to what else was taking place in the Soviet Union at that same time. The Soviet Union changed in the mid-1930s from a state which promoted Ukrainianization, promoted the Ukrainian language and culture, to basically a Russian nationalist Bolshevik state after 1934, and which it remained for most of its time until the 1980s. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church was destroyed, as well as the famine. Ukrainian national communists were arrested. Some committed suicide, like Skripnik and Khvylovey. Others were arrested and murdered. There was a massive killing of Ukraine's cultural elites, and the whole Soviet Union changed to become this Russian nationalist Soviet national Bolshevik regime. So it's not just the famine there, but the current Russian authorities have returned to the pre-Gorbachev denial that the famine took place in Ukraine, and they've had this opinion going back to the Yushchenko era. So again, nearly 20 years, they've been talking about this. Every Ukrainian president, so 5 Ukrainian presidents, have supported the notion, the concept that the Holodomor was a genocide. Only Yanukovych did not. So only 1 of 6. This final 2 concepts, that the idea of Stalin and the Great Patriotic War. Stalin is a new hero in Russia. The Great Patriotic War is a new religion in Russia. And the war against Ukraine is a second Great Patriotic War to again defeat the Nazis. Ukraine changed its approach to these questions already with Stalin going back to the late 1980s, but changed its approach to the Great Patriotic War in 2015 with the adoption of 4 de-Communization laws. Ukraine stopped commemorating the Great Patriotic War and began commemorating World War II. So from 1941 to 45, Great Patriotic War is out, and 1939 to 1945, World War II is in. Ukraine Europeanizes. It adopts the European approach, not the Soviet approach or the Russian approach to that period of time. That's important because the Great Patriotic War ignores what happened in West Ukraine. It ignores that period from 39 to 41, which applies to Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is then, as it were, annexed under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It also ignores the fact that Stalin was a war criminal, and that the Great Patriotic War is not something to celebrate. What's happened in Russia in the last 20 years is that Putin's Russia has moved away from the Gorbachev era. Instead of commemorating and being saddened about the Great Patriotic War as an event, as a war that should be not celebrated but denounced as something that was horrible for humanity, that led to huge numbers of suffering and casualties, over 20 million in the Soviet case. Putin's Russia changed in 2008 to have annual military parades and to celebrate military victory. So ignoring the human suffering and celebrate military victory. And this was part of the cult of war that began to be promoted inside Russia. So this is victory. We can do it again. We did it then, we can be victorious again. Doesn't matter how many people die. Then it doesn't matter, and now it doesn't matter, with 750,000 Russians dead in Ukraine. The final one, again, I've talked about, I won't talk for very long, the idea that Ukraine's a puppet state. This has long roots going back to the late 19th century. Then it was the Austrians and Poles promoting this artificial Ukrainian state. Now it's the CIA, Americans, and European Union. You can't accept that Ukrainians can be their own leaders. They're the ones who created the Ukrainian state. Of course, this creates problems for how you explain how these Ukrainians who don't exist in a country that doesn't exist have been able to fight and be successful against the Russian army for nearly 3 years. And the only way they can do that is by alleging that Russia is fighting not just Ukraine, but NATO inside Ukraine, which again is not true, but something that they have to say, because otherwise they'd have to admit that Ukrainians exist. they are fighting against Ukrainians, not just against NATO. And then they do this as well by expanding the alliance to include China, North Korea, and Iran, with the common goal of defeating the West and defeating the Western liberal order inside Ukraine. You do this, you destroy Ukraine, you destroy Israel as well, and then you are successful in transforming the world from a so-called unipolar world to a multipolar world, where Russia is recognized as a great power equal to the United States. So the aim of the war in Ukraine isn't just to destroy Ukraine and Ukrainians, it's to destroy the Western liberal world. This axis of upheaval, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, believes it's at war. It's maybe time for us in the West to also understand we are at war. Thank you.